Inga iwi o te whare tūmai nei tēnā koutou katoa. In our Pacific traditions, I would like to say tauwhalawa ma luelele, whakalofalahe atu, nisan bole venaka, kia orana, kamina Māori, talo hane, malo everyone. And thank you for taking the time to come and come to this presentation. So currently I'm a PhD student in under Marilyn and Peggy's supervision. This is actually my MPhil study from last year. So my world at the moment is in a different space to this, but I've been presenting and publishing on this topic because I have a career as a public servant, as a policy analyst. Currently I work as a strategist with the Counties Manukau DHB in the area of health equity and population health. So this study was a phenomenological study of the experiences of Pacific peoples as policymakers and policy analysts in the economic development field in the late 90s right through the first decade of the new millennium. And I want to pay respect to the previous speaker, Patsy, because she, right at the end, for those of you who weren't there, talked about a very significant thing that I'll be touching on, which is the whim of the decision maker and the impact on the end user, which is actually goes to the heart of this study. And I'm looking at the stuff behind the whim, the assumptions, the worldviews, the experiences, the cultural makeup. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus in on Pacific peoples and their relationship with the government system. I'm going to look at a very quick look at what the system is, but really importantly, what are cultural worldviews? Why might they be important in policy? And also I'll talk a bit about how the study has come about. So even though this presentation won't be directly about the research itself, these were the two research questions about the representations, but more importantly, the construction of representations of Pacific peoples by policy makers. So not just what was on the page, but how did it get there? What were the assumptions that led to the construction of words and imagery on a page in public policy? And the second research question, which unfortunately I won't have a lot of time to talk about today, but New Zealand is really unique. We have an organisation called the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs that has a mandate by central government to look after the interests of an ethnic grouping. It is one of the only entities of its type with a federal, unitary, central government focus in the world. And they play a significant role in the formation of public policy for Pacific peoples. I do very much apologise for the way the colours have turned out. I'm just going to quickly give us some context about where Pacific peoples sit in regards to public policy. So in policy, we often talk about the 7.4% of the national population who are Pacific peoples. 65.9% of Pacific peoples in New Zealand live in Greater Auckland. And a statistic that's really frequently used, 11.7% of Pacific peoples are unemployed, and young people, 16.2%. I want to use some different statistics, and that is the 2,700 policy analysts who don't live in Auckland but live in Wellington, and the 1.4% of the policy-making population that is of Pacific ethnicity. So you've got 1.4% of a grouping that makes rules for 7.4% of the population, and more importantly, 16%, a significant figure who face economic and social hardships and need great solutions. So what these statistics, in their very difficult read to form, says that we have a disconnect between the people who make the rules and the people who have to live by them. And this is where we come to the whim of the decision makers. How can the people who make the rules claim any kind of success when we have these statistics? But even below that, another level down, this is the way Pacific peoples are seen in public policy. Nothing to do with our rich cultures, our contributions to society, our economic processes of giving and reciprocity and care, our family structures, our care for environment, our care for society. When it comes to policy, where the system looks at a problem and then the scale of the problem. So this is where we start. This is the system in which policies and rules and decisions are made, and again, supporting a whim of decision makers. So I also wanted to point out from that last lot of stats that, again, that 1.4% of the policy-making population, that policy-making population, again, Wellington-based, as we'd said, it's largely white, and it's very largely male. If the population breakdown for Pacifica, they're not based in Wellington. They are slightly becoming more and more white as mixed ethnicity peoples grow, but still largely not white. And we have a significant number of women, and women who lead our population. So therefore, the group making the rules and the group living by them are very different. But, so a very, very, very brief run through the policy system. So as a government function so the study found that for Pacific peoples, over the 70s and 80s, advice, people in government and the periphery of government giving advice to politicians in the 70s and 80s increased in its formal clout. In the 1980s, Treasury was where the grunt of thinking was, and it was the briefing to the incoming Minister of Finance in 1987 had an annex on social policy which had a really significant piece of advice, and that was, for policy to be relevant to the population, people from the population must be writing the policy. Women, Māori, Pacifica, young people must be involved in setting the rules. And hopefully from the discussion that I've presented so far, you can see that as people are represented in policy making, the rules hopefully start to create policy interventions that support them. Again, I apologise for the formatting. So how does policy get made? Well, here is a very quick cycle. There's an agenda setting cycle where you work out what the needs are. You're working out who's around to present issues and provide answers to them. Policy is then formatted. You're looking at goals, you're looking at actions. Government ministers then have to take decisions. They have to balance decisions. They have to look at budgetary implications. Then there's implementing, so writing the policy, creating programs, getting it out into public, and then evaluation. Did it work? Was it equitable? Was it fair? I raise this because of that statistic early on. The people who were doing this were not always connected to the communities they were doing it for. However, there was the insistence of Treasury that you get the people in there to create, to what you would say, keep it real for the community. But that was the process they worked with. So, in the study, I interviewed 2 former ministers of Pacific Island Affairs and 2 former senior policy analysts. And I could reflect on my own experience. It was a Heideggerian hermeneutic phenomenological study. And what the study came up with was that, so the reason that you have a worldview is because it reflects your experience. It is the shared value of your community, your family, and your heritage. And for Pacific, that second point is really important because our kainga, our ainga always go with us. Our communities and our lands back home always go with us. But Pacific worldviews physically came in because our workers supported the economy. Tokelauan, Cook Island and Niuean people by birthright, as well as the generations of New Zealand-born Pacific people, are Pacific peoples and New Zealand citizens. The system needed to work for them. New Zealand-born people, and then we have the establishment of a minister's position as well as a government agency. So here was the intersection of the worldviews and the system. So the study itself, I'll quickly sort of skip through this, but so yes, it was a phenomenological study, Talanoa methodology. When we're interacting with Pasifika, there is no point having a fixed formatted interview because in the talanoa, it is the strength of the relationship between two people. And it's the sharing of the histories and the culture and the value of one person talking to one other person and the safety of that space to get where the great information comes out. So the sample, as I've explained, semi-structured talanoa interviews and also a review of key government documents. So before I get to the last bit, this is a quote by Billy Hauofer's seminal writing, Our Sea of Islands. Because time's against us, I'm not going to read it, but if you're looking at key words there, social centrality of the ancient practice of reciprocity, and it's the core of the cultures, interdependence, and purportedly the essence of the global system. Search for Our Sea of Islands if you ever want to understand how Pacific people work economically. So, these were the findings. So, the economic worldviews have endured across thousands of years. Those workers came to New Zealand not to prop up the New Zealand economy, but because they were contributing to their families back home. Their villages had chosen them to come to New Zealand. And this is a practice which, across the thousands of years of Pasifika migration, this is how our economy has worked. But there was an experiment. The experiment of having Pacific peoples in policy, having Pacific peoples in the economy, accepting that Pacific peoples work as part of New Zealand, that they might assimilate into the Kiwi mainstream. Well, that system did not work because we don't care about the boat, the batch, and the BMW, because we are far more invested in supporting our families and caring. And when it comes to tax advantages of donations, that stuff doesn't work for us. Income sharing would work for us, but because we have a policy-making system where there is still the male-female split, dad's out working, mum's at home, and it does well for one and not the other, and they're going to keep the system working for them. So for us, in public policy, that experiment failed because our people were not able to change that discourse, to change that argument at the policy level. So, very quickly to the future. We're a growing part of the population, and at the moment the demography projections are that if you count up Māori, Pasifika, our Asian communities, we are outnumbering New Zealand Europeans rapidly, and that figure is increasing. I talked earlier about the Ministry for Pacific Peoples being internationally unique. The question is that sustainable? But finally, what does this mean for other cultures around the world? And the Syrian migration will provide a significant situation in the future that will have to be dealt with potentially in similar ways. I didn't realise I'd actually go so close to the 15 minutes, but thank you so much for bearing with me and listening to this discussion.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I quite like it because it's a very emancipatory power to the people, which is great. My question is the size of your sample of participants.
Yeah.
Are there four?
There were
two
just
police analysts and two former ministers?
That's correct.
4 guys.
That's correct.
And how do you think you can have in-depth information that is representative of all Pacific countries and people out of 4 people?
Out of 4 people. Well, thank you for your question. And before I answer it, the emancipatory theme was at the heart of it. Yeah. So, bearing in mind, 1.4% of the population who do policy were Pacific. Therefore, it was impossible to find Pacific policy analysts. And I was going through my own networks because when you're 1.4%, you know everyone. You've related to so many of them, and you've worked with so many of them. And in the minister's perspective, there were you can count the number of ministers on your hand. Therefore, you have a small number to choose from. And I had hoped for 2 others who had to pull out. So to get the depth, I had budgeted 60 minutes for every interview. The shortest interview was 3 hours. And what I really didn't get to talk about in the research design was I talked very briefly about what we call the tala noa. So the tala noa is made up of two things: tala, to talk, noa, about nothing. And it's in the nothing where you create the relationship, where you get a deep, a very meaningful and very rich response. And so while this never ever can claim to be totally representative of all of our Pasifika diversity of thought, of knowledge and background, we got rich data that says there is more to come. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting to see a different statistic, rather, in the policy. Policy. So I think it's kind of shocking, actually, I'd say. But in your view, what skills do you think are required for Pasifika people to enter that level, the higher, the top level of policy, to be able to actually make these decisions and influence and help the community?
Well, thank you for that question. I'd turn it on its head a little bit and argue that there are so many Pasifika people who have the requisite skills. They can write, they can debate, they can read data. And the capabilities of our young people today to program SPSS and SAS to pull up data, it's mind-blowing. It's actually the system that needs to cope with them. And it's the changes at those top levels where, so for instance, I would sit in meetings all the time and go, well, all these Pacific people, they give to church, don't they get their tax receipts back? It's like, no, because we don't care about the tax value of giving. We care about what we're offering to our communities and to keep our ministers healthy and safe and the buildings going and enriching our communities. So it's actually the system that needs to grow skills in seeing things outside of so the two key things: to see things outside of an annual report baseline way of economics, and secondly, out of a rational single choice theory, because we don't make rational choices because there is so much more context that we have to work within. So, but thank you so much for your question.
Excellent. That's all the time we've got for questions at the moment, but I'm sure you'd love to field more questions during the lunchtime. We've got a huge amount of time at lunchtime where we can go through questions. So if we'd like to just give another round of applause, please.